Hello everyone and welcome to the Gunpla Network. I'm the Spicer and today's video covering the Master Grade Force Impulse is brought to you by Canadian Gundam. Canadian Gundam is your one-stop shop for all your Gunpla and Plamo needs here in North America. While you're checking their catalog and placing your order, don't forget to use the promo code Gunpla Network for 10% off. The ZGMF X56S/Alpha Force Impulse Gundam is one of the leading mobile suits from Gundam Seed Destiny. Originally being piloted by series protagonist Shin Asuka, and then later by Lunamaria Hawk, the Impulse Gundam, or the Force Impulse more particularly, is a devastating weapon in the right hands. Being the successor to the ever-so-popular Strike Gundam from Gundam Seed, the Force Impulse never quite reaches that level of popularity, but it does hold its own. Unlike its predecessor in the Strike Gundam, however, the Force Impulse and the Impulse Gundam itself are solely credited to be created by legendary mechanical designer Kunio Okawara. Well, the Master Grade Force Impulse is much older than, say, the likes of Lunamaria Hawk Zaku Warrior Master Grade. The question comes to bear, can this 2008 Master Grade stand up to the newer levels of standard in the Master Grade line and its contemporary in the Real Grade Force Impulse? Let's find out. The box for this Master Grade is pretty standard fare in comparison to anything else that came out around that time, and even so, things before it. It's pretty prominent. It's a big picture of the Force Impulse using the big Excalibur sword that we'll talk about a little later on, in a space setting which I don't recall ever seeing. I do remember it using that sword in this configuration to take down the Freedom, but not in this manner. On the side of the box we see all the gimmicks, and this thing is loaded with gimmicks, especially in terms of landing gear, which is kind of cool, but we'll talk about that more in a moment as well. In terms of the actual mobile suit itself, we get a pretty good rendering of the front view. Some nice builds, a little detail here and there, and of course this is painted up, so you'll need to detail it if you want it to look like that, but not too far off straight out of box. Moving a little further over, we see the Force silhouette and the two figures of Shin and Lunamaria. We see the silhouette flyer itself with its landing gear looking pretty good, and then the Force silhouette itself being attached onto the back. Much like its real grade counterpart, this is a gimmick you can use. However, I have not really wanted to use it, as that Force silhouette pack is quite heavy and stand options are a little difficult. We'll once again talk about that in a minute. In terms of the other side, we have more action poses, and this starts to show off one of the major issues with the Excalibur sword, as it is big and it's very heavy. So it's going to be a little bit of a problem that we'll dive more into in a moment, but just so you get some foreshadowing in. You do see some of the decals if you want to add those on, mainly the faith symbol there. There's enough to go around the whole kit for other things if you would like to do so, but you don't have to, of course. You have some articulation, and you of course have the option to recreate the fight with the Destiny with the Excalibur sword. It's kind of cool. I don't have the version 1 Freedom, but I do have the version 2 that we'll take a look at in a little bit. Then you just get the Force Impulse standing next to its mountain of runners. There's about 20 runners in this, so it's a big box. There's a lot in there. Speaking of runners, there are a ton of them, as I said. You get some multicolored runners, you get some regular whites, some no real off-white, kind of like you'd see with real grades, which it's pretty early for a Master Grade, so I can understand that. It's not too crazy. It would just been nice to see. You have a pretty regular tone of blue, nothing crazy, pretty standard Gundam blue and red. You have a very lavendery light blue for accents, which is very strange by comparison, is actually light blue on the Real Grade, and I want to say the line art, but I could be wrong. We'll take a look at that in a minute. You have a bunch of internal frame. This, of course, being a Master Grade around 2008, you had a full inner frame that was built, and we'll take a look at that once we get to that portion. Pretty standard, nothing crazy, no screws or anything like that. Went together well. After building this pretty much not right after, but I built the Master Grade Dynamis not too far, about a month ago. and it is pretty different. I would say, of course, it's an upgrade with time, but it's not so different that it's disappointing. Like, it's still a pretty solid frame. Then, of course, you get all of the decals and everything, all the beam effects, all that fun stuff. No big color correcting sticker sheet here at the Master Grade. It's kind of something you're going to assume. The manual is interesting. I usually don't talk about manuals because I really don't care all that much for them. But I do have to say some of the artwork in this manual is phenomenal. Some of the stuff we see, especially in certain sections. They don't do it for each one, but like the Silhouette Flyer and the Course Blender have a really nice piece of artwork. The Chest Flyer has one. You also have one, I believe, for the leg and just the fully assembled Chest Flyer. And then the Force Silhouette pack itself, and the weird strike back attachment for the Ale pack, or the other striker packs, I suppose. It's cool that it's in here. This might actually be a manual I keep just for those, because it does look really neat. And then you get the back of the manual with just a color splash of the kit itself. So generally speaking, pretty stable stuff, nothing too crazy. In terms of the frame, there's not a whole lot to write home about. Everything's pretty standard. Some of the proportions, mostly in the legs, are a little exaggerated, but nothing all that crazy. Nothing the armor isn't going to fix once you put it on there. And there are some nice armor pieces shining through, mostly just in the legs, but it's still nice that there are some venting and stuff, and you get some pistons a little bit lower down. In terms of its movement and stability, it's pretty solid. The only part I really had issue with in terms of the frame, the left arm, the left elbow, on mine was a little issue, heavy for whatever reason. It was either too tight or too loose depending on what I was trying to do. A lot of slow movement, so just understand that, which is, once again, not something that a lot of people building and posing Master Grades aren't familiar with. So pretty standard Master Grade frame, nothing really crazy here to talk about. Now, once we've got it all armored up, its visual appeal is interesting, to say the least. This Master Grade comes a lot closer to anime accuracy than something like the Real Grade, for example, for better or for worse. The color choices are much closer to its on-screen counterpart, I'd say. However, this may not be to everyone's liking. Now, of course, this presentation is straight out of the box. There are no decals on it. It does come with them if you decide to put them on. I left them off. But generally, if you're going to put them on, you know what they're going to look like. While this presentation is fine, when it's next to the Force Impulse, the Real Grade, the color scheme seems somewhat off and shallow. The light blue accents on the Master Grade come off as more of a lavender than a blue, and that kind of is a little weird. It doesn't stand out as much, it blends, and it just isn't as impactful. Now, of course, this comes down to a preference. Neither one looks bad, it's just when you've got them side by side, it's very noticeable. Now, of course, speaking of a side by side, here's a scaled comparison between the two kits. While I personally prefer the colors of the Real Grade, the Master Grade does have some better proportions in a few select areas. These mostly being the beam rifle, the Force Silhouette pack itself, and the feet. All of these are somewhat minor, however, the width of the beam rifle does make it feel fuller in comparison to the size of the model kit in the Master Grade. The Force Silhouette pack is a lot deeper, giving it more of more shelf presence, if you want to call it that, especially from different angles like upward shots and things like that. So if your shelf is above you, you're going to see it's going to feel a little bit bigger when you're looking up at it. The feet of the Master Grade Force Impulse are pretty much the only part of this design to take any kind of stylization. Their sharper, more angular cuts give them a rather noticeable part for a really unnoticed part of a model kit. It's really mind-boggling that they did this to the feet of all areas, and I'd like to see what this would look like on other parts of the kit, kind of a 2.0 vibe, if you will. This tiny bit of stylization kind of makes me think, how far back was Bandai thinking about doing a makeover like the Freedom 2.0, where it was very aggressively stylized? Because I'd love to see that kind of aggressive visual style adapted for a Force Impulse 2.0, as not only is it fitting for the design, but also a lot of the poses that it was used for in animation. Speaking of poses, the articulation on this older Master Grade is, well, serviceable. Allowing for a few of the signature poses to be done with little work, this kit is not all that frustrating to handle. In order to get the fullest out of the Force Impulse, of course, you will need an action base. Unfortunately, it doesn't come with one. While I didn't have one handy, I was able to get something to work, and, well, it's not ideal, it does function. I do, however, wish this came with a stand, seeing as this is the Force Silhouette. It's a flight unit. That's the whole point of it. I mean, sure, it's high maneuverability in space, but you see it flying a lot in the series, and it would just been nice to have that extra little bit of plastic in a pretty packed thing already. We'll talk about some of that extra plastic a little later on as well. I can understand the choice of adapters this uses. There's a lot of different versions in here for the base model, just because it's fairly big, and when you have the flight pack on, it is really heavy in certain areas, so it is something that I can understand them using a little bit thicker, weird connection, or having the little prong thing that you'd go plug into the hips. But something that's really strange, at least to me, is the Core Splendor and the Silhouette Flyer don't have like a 3mm peg or like really noticeable attachments for a base adapter. Now, of course, I believe there are things you can plug in. I haven't messed with them a whole lot to see if I can get them to work, just because, like I said, I don't have an action base handy. But it just, like, for something so small that wouldn't have weight issues, like a 3mm peg would work, and would be a lot more maneuverable in terms of what you would have option to plug it into, versus something like one of the bigger action-based style adapters. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure why they went this way, but, you know, Bandai's going to make Bandai decisions. Now, in terms of what you get with those two, the Force Silhouette, or the Silhouette Flyer and the Core Splendor, you do get some landing gear, which is cool. I mean, it's nice, but they're pretty small craft. You can put them on the front of a display if you want. They look kind of cool, but generally speaking, usually the Core Splendor is going to be in the Gundam, and then you're also going to have the Flyer, the Silhouette Flyer, doing something else, because it's not going to be holding the Force Silhouette pack. So kind of weird, a little extra. I mean, it's a nice gimmick, but you know, I'd rather have them think about some other things, like some gimmicks like maybe an action base instead of this extra plastic that we don't end up using, because you also get landing gear for the leg and chest flyer, which once again will, I would assume, the vast majority of people will not use in displays. Maybe they will, but I would say those are really the hardcore fans of the Force Silhouette. It's neat that they're there. I just wish they'd have spent their attention on something else, because there are a lot of little parts that you can lose here. Which, I mean, like I said, it's nice to have inclusion, have a lot of extra posable options and such, I suppose, but it just feels like it's a variety of gimmicks instead of them focusing on like major options that you could use for posability, like an action base, or perhaps maybe like some articulation in the torso or shoulders. Yes, this is indeed an older Master Grade, as the torso's waist connection is woefully inadequate for such a large backpack. It is constantly pulling the torso back, i.e. say something like the Real Grade Sinanju, something with a huge backpack and a really, really weak torso connection to the waist. All it is a ball joint, so as you would imagine, it's going to get pulled back. And it's not a huge problem until you start getting into some slashing poses. Then you can't move it forward at all. You'd have to use a stand to do that, and then it's a whole mess from there in terms of trying to balance it without it falling off. So, something to consider there if you're looking at this build and what poses you'd want to put it in. Conversely, the shoulders are somewhat similarly standard in terms of old Master Grades. No pullout or sliding gimmick, just rotation on a peg for the most part, and that doesn't become an issue until you start trying to pose it with the signature MMI 710 Excalibur anti-ship laser sword. As I said before, this thing is massive and it is unwieldy, although it is really nice to look at. The size and weight of this massive sword makes this a really difficult thing for the kit to hold, even if you can get both hands on it. While the elbows never seem to be the problem, it's usually the wrist and shoulder joints that are going to cause you the pain. especially if you have just one hand on the hilt. It is a little frustrating for such a cool weapon, but I can understand as to why it's that way, because it is a big sword. You're going to have weight issues. It has been nice to see something done in the shoulders to be able to hold it fairly easily with both hands, because that is a whole nother ballgame when you're trying to get both arms to grab the hilt, and neither one of them wants to go that far. Now, I do want to take a moment here to acknowledge that comparing this 13-year-old Master Grade to something as new as the Real Grade Force Impulse or the Master Grade Freedom 2.0 isn't really fair. Both of these kits were made with lessons learned from kits like the Master Grade Force Impulse. So in order to bring some perspective to this review, I thought it was only right to compare it to one of its contemporaries in 2006's Master Grade Strike Freedom. Both of these kits are more focused on a less stylized, fuller proportioned design to bring them closer to anime accuracy. Both kits achieve this desired effect and look pretty good doing it. Back in 2008, the Force Impulse would have been pretty on par with everything in terms of existing Seed Master Grades. However, it would be a whole different level of gimmicky in comparison to anything before it. It does have the combination gimmick, and then you have not only that ability to combine it, but all of the landing gear to have everything separate and standing on its own, which is nice. It is a cool gimmick, and I'm sure some people had used it, but personally I'm not a huge fan of it. While I could see a new 2.0 doing well, for its time the Master Grade Force Impulse checked all the right boxes and then some, and still has its own place in the world now. If 2020 is hindsight, it does make me wonder if Bandai maybe learned a little something from the Master Grade Force Impulse. Maybe they thought the Excalibur sword was just a bit too much for the Real Grade Force Impulse to handle. This was one of the minor issues I had with the Real Grade, but after handling this massive sword in the Master Grade here, I can see why it might have been omitted. It is really big and it's really unwieldy, and even though the Real Grade is a little bit tighter and has more articulation, it is just really difficult to make a sword this size in scale with something and have it be, good looking, stable, but also being able to wield it, so I can understand some of the choices made. All in all, the Master Grade Force Impulse is a solid release for its time. While it's not going to outclass any of the newer Master Grades on your shelf, it does have its place. The fuller proportions and the anime-accurate aesthetic will help it stand out, or blend in depending on where you put it on your shelf and depending on your personal preferences. If you're a fan of the design or Master Grades in general, I'd say it's a solid purchase. However, if you're looking for something more challenging or advanced, I'd say there's a fair few kits to look at first. All in all, this has been a pleasant build, and something that I've enjoyed messing with even if I didn't have the correct stand. I've been the Spicer here for the Gunpla Network. Put those comments down below and I will try to answer any questions to the best of my ability. As always, friends, stay safe and keep on building.